guys. Thanks a lot for having me. My name is Marco. I'm Italian. Apologies in advance for my accent. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I've been an MVP for the last 13 years. In the last 3 to 4 years, I've been working with a company which operates in the software as a service market. So they have a product. You can go on their website, sign up, and it's for business consumers, so it's not really for normal customers. But obviously, it was so interesting developing it. I mean, we found some very peculiar challenges. I was like, oh wow, I need to do a talk about it, and that's why I'm here. Okay, so we're going to talk about building a software as a service applications in ASP.NET Core and Azure, and in order to do that, we're going to use this crappy website, which is basically a version of Slack made by someone who can't design a proper website. But even if, you can't appreciate it fully from distance, but yeah, here it is. But even though it looks crap, right, but it will serve the purpose of explaining most of the concepts that I want to cover this evening. This is a talk that's it's usually 1 hour, so I'll try to condense it in 45 minutes. But basically, what we're going to build is a software that is multi-tenant, first and foremost. So many customers, many companies are running on the same physical infrastructure, coexisting in there. And when that happens, the first and most important thing is ensuring data isolation. It's a bit here in the corner, but yeah, probably isolation. But yeah, data isolation. So how do we make sure that there aren't any data leak between company and company, basically? Then I want to provide the possibility to my customers to have their own custom domain. So they perhaps a second level domain, pretty much like Slack, where you can have your workspace in the URL. And last but not least, probably it's one of the most important features, we want to support corporate single sign-on. So especially in the business scenario, no one will adopt your platform, no matter how good it is, if you're not supporting corporate single sign-on. I mean, username and password are probably something that was good 15 years ago, but now it's not a thing. Okay. Before we get started and we start playing with this tool here, just let me add one disclaimer, right? So this is not the best solution ever. So as always, context is king. So this solution it might work for some cases, might not work for yours, but my hope is that I will give you some ideas, some food for thoughts, so that you can perhaps project them into your context. And I mean, most importantly, perhaps they will help you solving some issues while building your tools. Okay, so let's start by talking about the first point, which is keeping data siloed, right? So how do we ensure that there is data isolation between my companies? So what are the possible strategies that we can adopt? If we look at the Microsoft website, there's a page in the documentation that talks about this. I forgot to add the link here, but basically they suggest 3 options. The first option is to have separate databases. That's the simplest thing we can do, right? So data is physically separated, right? The 3 different instances of Azure SQL, and the only thing that we need to do is basically switching connection string depending on who's the user connected. Okay, super fancy. What is the problem? Well, if you're using Azure SQL, for example, and perhaps you're paying by V4 or DTUs, obviously that cost gets multiplied by the number of customers that you have, so it's not always practical. The second thing is that obviously maintaining this thing is kind of painful, right? Because you have your tables, your objects duplicated 10 times, once per client, and you create a new stored procedure, you modify your existing stored procedure. Good luck with updating everything. Second option is having separate schemas, right? Solves the problem of the cost, perhaps, right? Even though you could solve it with other means, for example, pooled databases. But you still have the problem of maintenance, right? You still have the problem of duplication of objects, and you need to sort out. And the third thing is probably what you've been thinking so far. So why are you bothering with databases and things like that? Let's just stick a company D in all my tables, all right? So my discriminator column, okay? Yeah, that's good. It's spoiler alert. It's what we're going to do, right? but we're going to do it with a pinch of salt, right? So with a bit of carefulness. Why? Because obviously, if my strategy for data isolation is that, right? What happens if, because of a bug, I mean, this really looks simple, right? It's easy to check whether I've forgotten my work condition or not. But when things start getting more complex with joins and things like that, it's easier to make mistakes and perhaps, leaking data. And when you leak data, basically your customer from Acme sees everything from Contoso and Fabricam, and that is probably something that you don't want to happen, right? It could be very detrimental for the reputation of your product. So what can we do? Can we do anything better than this? Yes, there is a feature in SQL Server called row-level security that we perhaps adopted in the product I was talking before, which is quite interesting. And at the same time, for some reason, it's kind of unknown to most of the web developers I've come across. And why is it interesting? Well, because thanks to row-level security, what we can do is that we can assign a context to my users, right? So when they connect to the database, I can say, okay, the context for the blue user is Acme, the context for the green user is Contoso. And then I can define a policy, which now is a bit hidden by this cable here. But I can define a policy in the database that says only return a row if the company ID of that row matches the one of the context of the connection. Okay, and this is basically what we're going to play with for the next few minutes, I would say. All right, so let's head to Visual Studio, which is here, and nice that I splitting a little bit here. Let's have a look at what we have here first and foremost. So we have an application which is made of there's a backend made in ASP.NET Core, this one, and there's a front end made in Blazor. Okay, now Blazor, I know that it's not perhaps really common as a front end technology, but in the concepts that we're gonna play with, it doesn't really apply with any front end technology, being it React.js, Vue.js, whatever you want. And okay, well, let's try to run it and see what happens. Okay, let me start it. Yeah, basically it's pretty much like the thing that I had in my slides, right? So I have my company ID at the minute specified here in the query string, but bear with me, we're going to fix it soon. Okay, just be patient. And as you can see, this is Acme, right? And I can see the data from Acme, right? If I switch the company ID to Contoso, I go here and I see the data from Contoso, as I would expect. Okay, how does it work under the hood? Under the hood, I have this very simple API, rooms controller. I haven't shown you all the other functionalities where you can actually visit the room, write messages, and things like that, right? So it is simple, but it's not really simplistic. And in my controller here, what I'm doing is that I'm just doing a where condition like the one that we saw on the slides, right? And for example, here, when I'm returning all the rooms, I'm saying, is it too small? Let me zoom this. And I'm going to do this. Okay. Here I'm saying, okay, return me only the rooms where the company equals to, and at the minute, how do I return the current company ID for the user? I've abstracted this with this interface, iCompany context accessor, right? Which basically I'm mimicking the HTTP context accessory of ASP.NET Core, right? So this returns this company context that basically contains a company ID. And at the minute, I'm just retrieving the company ID from the routing. Again, this is something that is absolutely not secure. I could just mess up with the routing, with the URL, put any company ID, I would see anything, right? But again, bear with me, we're going to fix it. Okay. And the fact that I have an abstraction here allows me to switch the strategy by which I retrieve the company ID. All right, so obviously, in my rooms controller, if because of a bug, I forget to add this where condition when the application runs, and I'm here in Contoso, I see everything, and that is a problem, okay? How does role-level security make it better? Well, let's head to SQL Management Studio for a second. And let's try to, this is really almost unreadable. Let's make it like this. Let's see what happens with role-level security and how to implement it. So the first thing I need to do, and the reason will be clear in a moment, is creating a schema, which we can call security, okay? And then I have my rooms table, which is this one, right? I have ID, name, and the company ID, okay? And all I need to do is creating a function like this one. I zoomed in too much, probably. Okay, a function like this one, which let's imagine that this function gets called for each row that we want to return, okay? And for each row, we're going to receive the company ID of that row as a parameter. What am I doing in the body of this function? I'm returning 1 in case the user has access to that company ID. And how can I determine this? Well, if the user is an administrator, it's always 1. So, for example, if the user is using, I don't know, SQL Management Studio, always 1, I want to see everything, right? But otherwise, I'm going to look at the company ID attribute that I've defined in my session context of my connection to the database, right? And only return 1 if that session context matches the company that I have as a parameter. Okay, that's the general idea. And I can do the same thing, for example, for the messages table that has one peculiarity. It doesn't have the company ID here, right? I only have the room ID that message belongs to, right? But I can still apply. I will not delve into the details of this function. It's very simple. You can have a look at the code by yourself, right? But you still want to protect the messages so that even if I have a query that is a selected star from messages, I only see the messages that I'm actually entitled to see, even though I'm not joining it with rooms, okay? And so let me create these two functions. Don't remember if I've already created the schema. Oh, yes. Yeah. Okay. And once I have these two functions, now I can create my first policy, which is a rooms filter policy. And here I'm saying, you know what? Create a policy called room filter and apply a filter predicate to the table rooms, depending on the result of this function here. And as you can see here, I'm passing the, you can't really see it from, this is the company ID column of the rooms table. And as you can see, I've also added a predicate to prevent the insert and an update, right, onto this table if I don't have the right security context. Okay. So I'm going to do this. And I have a similar thing for the messages. Okay. Right. Now, let's start playing with it. But before we start playing, I'm with an administrator. So I can't really use an administrator because I wouldn't see everything, right? So I need a less powerful user. And that's why I'm creating this chat app user. And the interesting bit here is that I'm only granting this user access to the DBO schema. It doesn't have access to the security schema, which is really important because even if I had the worst SQL injection vulnerability ever, this user will never be able to mess up with the policies that I've just created. Okay, that's really important. Okay, now that I have everything in place, I can do a select here. And for some reason, the zoom of the font only works with the code. But as you can see, hopefully you can see it, I'm an admin, I can see everything, right? Acme and Condoso, rooms and messages, right? But the moment that I impersonate my chat app user and I execute this store procedure, which is set session context, company ID key, this is basically a dictionary, right? Value Acme, right? So I'm doing this and I execute exactly the same query, nowhere condition, and hopefully, yeah. Then I switch to company ID Contoso And if I do this, yeah, I can see only Contoso. Okay. The interesting bit is that obviously, if I then try to do perhaps an insert, right, this insert gets blocked, right, because I'm trying to insert to Acme, and I'm a Contoso user, right? And the interesting bit, this is the thing that is actually makes this really powerful. So what happens if I do pretty much the equivalent of forgetting my where condition? So I forget to set the session context. So the session context is null, right? What do you expect to see here? No. Exactly. So I get no results, right? So this is the thing that makes it really powerful as a safety net for our mistakes. Okay. Obviously, if I revert it and try to run everything as an admin, I see everything again. Okay. All right. How do we apply this to our application? Well, first and foremost, while I'm using an entity framework here, so I need a way. Well, first and foremost, I need to switch to that chat app user, right? So I have a connection string here that is the chat user connection string, right? And I need to make sure that I'm using this one and not connecting as an admin. And the other thing is I need a way to intercept when entity framework is running a query against my database to inject that session context. Now, this is specific to entity framework. Obviously, it will also work if you're using Dapper or any other thing. You just need something that runs before your queries in order to be able to set that session context. And the way we can do it with the EF is by defining a DB command interceptor. A DB command interceptor is a class that gets called every time EF has prepared a command. So it's just before executing it on the database. And depending on which type of command that is, it could call one of these three methods: non-query executing, reader executing, or scalar executing. I guess that if you played with ADO.NET in past, you know inside out what this means, right? And what I'm doing here is that, as you can see, these methods receive a DB command as an input, right? This is the command that EF has prepared for you, and it's ready to execute. And what I'm doing is that I'm calling this this add session context here. And here I'm basically just prepending this command text. Let me zoom this in a little bit because this is important. This prepending this exec SP set session context company D with my company D parameter to the actual command text that EF has prepared, right? And I'm setting the value of that company D by using the same company context accessor that I was using in the controller. Okay, all clear? Great. Now I just needed to make sure that EF is using this interceptor, and you can do it with the override of the onConfiguring method, right? Add interceptors, and I add my session command interceptor. I relaunch the application. And as you can remember, I still have the bug in which I've commented out the where condition on the rooms, right? But yeah, as you can see now, Contoso only shows my rooms for Contoso. Okay, so this is basically what we achieved with row-level security. Does it mean that we can just remove all our where conditions? I wouldn't recommend it. It's also for performance reasons. The impact that because the policy gets evaluated for each of the rows that the result set will return. Okay, so if you can filter them out with a where condition, perhaps SQL can apply I don't know, some optimizations, indexes, and things like that. So it's always better, even for performance reasons, to keep your where conditions. But this is a safety net against your mistakes. Okay, right. So we sorted the first problem out. Now we can start talking about delivering our website to our customers. Okay, so what do we mean with delivering? What we mean is that with this written UI and API here, So I'm probably going to deploy my API and UI within the two app services in Azure. On the other end, I have my acme.enterprisechat.com or contoso.enterprisechat.com, or in general, whatever .enterprisechat.com. I need something that takes the request from there and delivers it here. Okay. And how I'm going to explain this? Well, I'm not using the portal. I've taken a few screenshots here and there so that you can go download the slides and you can potentially use them as a reference to replicate the same thing that I've done. Okay, so there are several ingredients that we need in order to achieve our results. And the first ingredient is obviously a DNS, right? The DNS can be any DNS that you want, your GoDaddy DNS or your Azure DNS. I usually tend to use Azure's because since I deploy everything in Azure, they are more integrated with the rest of the infrastructure, right? But it doesn't really matter. The only thing that matters is that this DNS will point to a public IP which sits in Azure. Okay, so I have my public IP, and the way I've configured it, this is now quite tricky to show it in this small display, right? Small projector. But basically, as you can see, I've just set a star domain, star subdomain, and I'm pointing it to the public IP address that I've just defined. Okay, what this allows me is that basically, if let me open the terminal one sec. If I open the terminal and do this in a little bit, and I do resolve DNS name acme.enterprisechat, network still works, good. It points to that DNS, to that IP address. If I do it with Contoso, same address, and if I do it with anything, same address, right? So basically, my DNS doesn't depend from the client who's connecting. Cool. Okay. Next step is after we configure that, we need to route our traffic towards our app services, and we needed to configure a few rules, and the best option that we have here is using Application Gateway in Azure. Okay, what is Application Gateway? Application Gateway is basically like it's a reverse proxy fundamentally, right? That allows you to configure a number of things, and we will configure quite a lot of them. And it's mainly composed by a number of subsystems, right? The first one that we will come across is the listener. The listener is something that is there. You point it to a public IP, and it listens to connections to that for connections to that public IP. And we want that listener to accept HTTPS connections, right? So we can configure it by saying, yeah, point to the public IP address that we defined and accept an HTTPS connection. But any HTTPS connection will require a certificate, right? So we needed this certificate, and we might want that certificate to be a wildcard certificate so that it can adapt to any subdomain. And it could be a bit more expensive than normal, but you can also generate one for free with Let's Encrypt, like I've done. Okay, so Let's Encrypt supports also wildcard certificates. And where do we store this wildcard certificate? We store it in Key Vault, all right? But we need a way to authenticate to Key Vault and be able to retrieve that certificate, right? And in order to do that, we can configure a managed identity. So it's an identity managed by Azure, right? We assign that identity the permissions to connect it to Key Vault, and down here, we tell the listener to connect to this particular Key Vault, retrieve this certificate, and use this managed identity that I just created. Okay, so we don't have to manage any passwords, nothing. Okay, Azure does it for us. Right. Now that we have our certificate, we can create we can create the rules, right? The rules to route the traffic to the API app service or to the UI app service, depending on what request that is. And the way we're going to do that is based on the presence of that fragment /API in my URL, right? And this is something that is also supported by probably one of the most important features of App Gateway, right? So as you can see, what I've done there is creating a path-based rule that intercepts the presence of /API/star in my URL. And in that case, it sends the request to the API pool, right? Otherwise, if that path is not present, it just sends as a fallback anything else to the UI. Okay, great. The last thing that we need to do is making sure that that Acme subdomain eventually becomes this query string company, the Acme that we saw before. All right, so we need to intercept that fragment of the URL and transform it into this, right? And same thing here in the API. I'm using a path in the API simply because it was easier to avoid paths here in Blazor because of the relative URLs that Blazor uses. So how do we do that? We do it with another feature, which is called URL rewrite. Those of you who have played with IIS in the past will know this as well, right? And a rewrite rule in App Gateway is basically an if-then condition, right? What I've done here is saying, okay, look at the host variable, so the request, and intercept star.enterprisechat.com. That one is a regular expression, so anything that is prior to enterprisechat.com. And if you find it, the action would be set a query string, in this case, with company D equals to variable, the variable that I've captured in the host. So here, the first variable. So this one means the first variable, which is in my case, the first and only variable that I've captured, right? So this one. Okay, so this will basically transform that acme.enterprisechat.ok into a query string company equals to acme. Okay, one important implication of this is that this requires a server-side component in the UI. Why is that? Because if you think about it, Blazor runs on your browser, right? So no matter how many rewrites you do on the server side, but the browser will always see acme.enterprisechat.com, right? It's not a redirect, right? That happens under the hood. So that's why we need a server-side component here that tells Blazor that actually, unless we want to add a rule in Blazor to capture that first level subdomain, right, which is not great, something that tells Blazor how to configure itself, or Blazor or your React application. And the way I've done this is basically exposing a configuration endpoint on my UI web server. What does it mean? It means that when I start my application, right, say that I receive a call to contoso.enterprisechat.co.uk, what I'm doing is that I'm making a call from the browser to same URL /configuration. Okay, this will be captured by App Gateway and sent to UI Azure websites, company D Contoso in the query string. And this allows me from the server side to read that Contoso variable and produce a configuration like this one, which is the client-specific configuration. So for example, what is the client ID? What is the API URL that you should call? And we will add some stuff later on, right? And yeah, this is basically what we do, right? We use this to configure our application. And yeah, the only thing is that I tried to buy the enterprisechat.com domain, but it was quite expensive. So I used enterprisechat.co.uk. But apart from that, everything I described in the slides is actually what I've done. Okay, so let's have a look at this. And so I've already deployed it, but let me just switch to the branch here, delivery, and let's run it first. It's more interesting. So I can go here, do acme.enterprisechat.co.uk, And as you can see, so everything is happening under the hood. I see my Acme endpoint, and let me just go to Contoso. Contoso, that's mistyped. Yeah, sorry. Not easy. Okay. Yeah, here you go. And as you can see, Blazor makes this call to the configuration endpoint. Hopefully you can read it from there, right? And this configuration endpoint returns this initial configuration that we've seen on the slides. Okay, it will get more interesting in a second, but for now, I mean, we have the infrastructure here. Okay. In the code, the way I've implemented this is basically, if I go and look at the solution, now I have this other project, Enterprise Chat UI Server. This is the ASP.NET Core application that serves the single-page Blazor application. It could be serving your React.js application, right? It's basically the thing that exposes the configuration point for me. And this configuration endpoint is basically, well, it's incredibly simple at the moment. It just returns, reads the company ID from the URL, and that just returns a hard-coded JSON for now. Okay, clear so far? Great. How much do I have? 5 minutes, 10 minutes? 5 minutes. Let's do 10 minutes, please. Okay, great. So in the interest of time, let me just switch to this other branch, and let me deploy this. In the meantime, that we talk about security a little bit, because we've achieved the two results, right? We created we configured the isolation of the database, we created the delivery network. Now we need to talk about the enterprise single sign-on, which will be the next and last chapter of the talk, right? And let me, okay, this is deploying, and in the meantime, let me go back to the slides, and let's talk about the single sign-on. Okay, so again, 2 results out of 3 achieved. Let's talk about the latest one. Corporate single sign-on. Now, the complexity with corporate single sign-on is that your clients can literally use anything, right? Could be, some of them could be on Google Suite, some of them Active Directory if you're lucky, Auth0, Okta, right? Literally AFS. And one option would be having our application being able to work with any of these, but this is a kind of a problematic, obviously, for obvious reasons, because the moment that you need to support something different, you probably need to make a code change to deploy and things like that, right? So it's not really ideal, right? The best option that we have is to use an identity provider, a single identity provider with the capability of federating these external identity providers, okay? And for the sake of this presentation, I've used Azure Active Directory B2C. All right, we're going to leverage 3 features of Azure Active Directory B2C to implement all of that. But the general idea is that we have our application that only knows about Azure AD B2C, right? So we only integrate, our code only works with one identity provider, and then we let that provider do the magic and do the federation, so federation with the other ones. How many of you have worked with Azure AD B2C in the past? Yeah, right. Okay, so what is the first feature that we're going to use? The first feature is, again, this federation support, right? So the capability of registering in B2C external identity providers. And in my example, what I'm going to do is registering an OpenID Connect provider for each of the clients that I want to support. Okay? So I'm going to create one for Acme and one for Contoso, for example. And the interesting bit is that in order to do that, we only need to ask for 3 information to our client, right? One is the metadata URL. This is a peculiarity of an OpenID Connect identity provider. And then they need to create an application on their end with client ID and client secret. Okay? So once we have that, we can basically say that we can support any identity provider that works with the OpenID Connect protocol. All right. So no matter if it's Okta, ADFS, whatever, we should be able to work with it. Then we need to enforce the client-specific identity provider depending on which is the URL that the user is connecting to, right? So if the user is going to contoso.enterprisechat.co.uk, we need to use the Contoso identity provider. And how do we do that? With another feature of the second feature of B2C, which is client flows, right? What is user flows? What are the user flows? The user flows are basically a configuration of the flow the user has to go through to authenticate and get the token basically from B2C, right? And the idea here again is to create a client-specific flow, so one for Acme, one for Contoso, all right? And one of the things that we can configure in each of these user flow is the identity provider that needs to be used. So when it's the Acme user flow, we only configure the Acme identity provider, right? Contoso, same thing. And how do we tell the UI which user flow it needs to use in order to perform the authentication? Well, we just built, if you remember, a configuration endpoint, right? So we can add the name of the flow that we want to use to that configuration endpoint. The result of that is that if the deploy has gone through, and apparently it is, if I go back to the browser 1 second, now I open an incognito window and I go to acme.enterprisechat.co.uk. Yeah, it's redirecting me to my corporate Azure Active Directory now. Okay, this is not the tenant where I've deployed the application. This is my separate tenant for working, so it's not the tenant that I use for these demos, right? And I can go here, log in with my username. I even have the MFA here, not passwordless. Yay, log it in, right? And this will log me in. Hello, Marco, logged in. And in a moment, we will also see, hopefully, the rooms for Acme. And if I do the same for Contoso, enterprise chat.
Can I do a time check with you, Marco?
Yes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes. 2 minutes. 2 minutes, 2 minutes. And as you can see, Contoso is redirecting me to Okta, for example, right? Test user, sign in. And yeah, I'm signing in with Okta. Okay. There's one last thing. I promised you that I was going to talk about the 3 features of Azure AD B2C that we're going to use. Well, we only named the 2, right? The identity providers and the user flows, right? So this allowed me to log in successfully, switching identity provider dynamically depending on the URL, right? There's there's the third feature, which is how do we make sure that actually also the API is protected from unwanted access. So we need to make sure that if I've logged in with Contoso, I can only access the Contoso data, right? So how do we map the identity provider that has been used to the company that that user has access to, right? So what is the idea? Well, the idea is that the user, we've seen this part of the flow, right? The user will go there, log in with Okta, perhaps. This is the Contoso user, goes to Okta, okay? And then there's this feature called token enrich that I can configure in B2C, by which B2C will make a call to a server-to-server call to an API that I'm exposing, okay? And what I created it with an Azure function just to keep it simple, right? But what is the general idea here? That before returning the control to the user, so before effectively authenticating the user, this call happens on a server-to-server basis, right? And this function could read from a database some information about the claims that Okta has returned and use them to understand that actually this is Contoso. How do we do that? Well, if you remember, one thing that we asked our clients was to provide us this metadata URL. Okay, and in this metadata URL, one important information is the issuer. Right now, it turns out that this issuer is a URI that needs to be unique within B2C. So you can't create two identity providers in the same B2C that have the same issuer. Even if I was a rogue user, I wanted to mimic the tenant ID of Microsoft, so login.microsoftonline/that tenant. I couldn't create an issue that if Microsoft is already registered in that Azure AD B2C. So this is the perfect key for us to store in a database, perhaps, and match it with Contoso to uniquely say, you know what, this user is actually Contoso, and then we can configure this function to return a custom attribute, custom claim that gets added to the claims of the user, right? The job token that we send to the API. And at this point, we can then think of replacing. You remember that we had that company context accessor initially based on the routing, right? Which was very, very fragile, right? I could just go there and tamper it, right? Now I can create a version of it that instead looks for the claims in the job token, right? And that is way more secure because it's digitally signed, and therefore no one can mess up with it, right? And then perhaps I can even add the policy company must match. So basically to compare the Acme that I get in the URL with the Contoso that I got from the job token. If there is a mismatch, I can return a 403, you're not authorized. Okay. Now, in the interest of time, I will not be able to show you this in the code, but you feel free to go and download it. It's in GitHub, and there are also some other interesting things like. For example, there's a console application that shows you how to handle Fabricam that decides to join our platform. So what do we need to do with Fabricam when they join? What is the impact? What does it take to create a new tenant in our application? If you think about it, our delivery network, our low-level security database are completely independent from Fabricam, Contoso, whatever. They work with anything, right? So we only need to configure Azure AD B2C to be able to authenticate with a single sign-on, and we're done. So there is a console application that shows you that. Just with a bunch of Graph API calls, it configures Azure Active Directory, and you're good to go. And yeah, that's it.